Hey guys. Tonight we are going to look at a map of the world. But not the map you know. If you look at a globe today, the shapes of the continents seem permanent, solid, eternal. But if you were to peel back the layers of time, just a few thousand years, those familiar lines would dissolve. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine standing on the coast of England, looking east towards Europe. Today, you see only the grey, rolling waves of the North Sea. Cold, deep, and unforgiving. But if you stood in that exact same spot just 8,000 years ago, you wouldn't see an ocean. You would see a forest. You would see a vast, lush plain stretching out as far as the eye could see. Rivers winding through tall grasses. Herds of red deer moving through the mist. Smoke rising from small campfires in the distance. This is Doggerland. It was not a myth. It was real. It was a landmass that connected Great Britain to the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark. It was the heart of Europe. A Garden of Eden in the north, where our ancestors hunted and fished and lived for thousands of years. You could walk on dry land from London to Berlin. You could hunt a deer in what is now the middle of the sea and carry it home to a village that is now buried under 50 meters of salt water. It was a rich land. The rivers were teeming with pike. The forests were full of hazel and oak. For the Mesolithic people living there, it was paradise. But the world was warming. The great ice sheets of the last ice age were melting, and the water was rising. The end of Doggerland didn't happen in a single day. At least, not at first. It was a slow, creeping tragedy. Year by year, the coastline moved inland. The hunters would return to their favorite fishing spots, only to find them gone, swallowed by the grey water. The marshes grew wider, the dry land grew smaller. It was a slow-motion apocalypse. Families had to pack up their camps, move to higher ground, and look back as their homes disappeared beneath the tide. The heart of Europe was becoming a lagoon. But then came the final blow. Around 6,200 BC, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide. Billions of tons of rock and mud collapsed into the deep ocean. It created a tsunami of terrifying power. A wall of water, perhaps 20 meters high, raced across the North Sea. It crashed into the low-lying plains of Doggerland. The water swept through the forests, destroyed the settlements, and drowned the landscape. For the people living there, it must have seemed like the gods were angry. One moment, a quiet morning. The next, the horizon lifting up and the ocean coming to take everything. When the water receded, The land was poisoned with salt, the trees died, the soil turned to mud, and slowly, relentlessly, the ocean finished the job. Doggerland slipped beneath the waves forever. Today, Doggerland is a ghost. It exists only on the maps of geologists and in the nets of fishermen. Sometimes in the North Sea, a trawler will pull up its nets expecting fish, but instead they find something else. A mammoth tusk stained brown by the peat. A stone spear point perfectly carved by human hands. A jawbone of a red deer. These are the debris of a lost world, artifacts from a country that drowned. Archaeologists have mapped the seabed, and they have found the ghosts of rivers, valleys, hills and lakes, all preserved perfectly under the silt. They call it Europe's lost frontier. It is a haunting thought. Just beneath the keels of the ships crossing the channel lies a landscape where people once laughed and loved and told stories around the fire. They didn't know they were living on a sinking ship. They didn't know that their home would one day be nothing but a blank blue space on a map. Doggerland reminds us that the ground is not as solid as we think. The map is always being redrawn, and sometimes entire worlds simply wash away. Let the grey waters of the North Sea fade away, and let us travel south. We are going to a place that is synonymous with emptiness, the Sahara Desert. If you close your eyes and picture the Sahara today, you see yellow. You see endless, rolling dunes of sand. You feel the heat, blistering and relentless, rising off the ground in shimmering waves. You hear the silence of a place where life struggles to exist. It is a hostile ocean of silica, stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. But time is a trickster. If we were to turn the clock back, roughly 9,000 years, to the early Holocene, this familiar yellow map would turn a deep, vibrant green. This is the era of the Green Sahara. It wasn't a desert, it was a savanna, a paradise of lush grasses, scattered acacia trees and massive, sprawling lakes. Imagine standing in the middle of what is now the driest place on Earth. Instead of sand, you are standing in tall, waving grass that brushes against your waist. Instead of the dry wind, you feel a humid breeze, heavy with the smell of rain and wet earth. And the silence is gone. The air is filled with noise. You hear the trumpeting of elephants. You hear the heavy splashing of hippos wallowing in deep, muddy rivers. You hear the roar of lions hunting in the tall grass. It sounds impossible. Hippos in the Sahara. Crocodiles in the middle of the desert. But the fossil record doesn't lie. Paleontologists digging in the middle of the dunes have found them. They have found the bones of fish, catfish the size of humans, buried in the sand. They have found the skeletons of crocodiles, preserved in areas where not a single drop of rain falls today. For a few thousand years, the Earth tilted slightly on its axis, just a subtle wobble. But it was enough to pull the tropical monsoon rains northward. The rains that soak the Congo today fell on the Sahara then. The desert bloomed. It woke up, and for thousands of years it was the most populated and vibrant place in Africa.
Humans lived here, and they thrived. Deep in the desert, in places like the Tasselina J Plateau in Algeria or the Gilf Kabir in Egypt, there are caves hidden in the cliffs. If you climb up to them today, escaping the brutal sun, and look at the walls, you will see the ghosts of this lost world painted in red ochre. These are the famous rock art galleries of the Sahara, and what they show is breathtaking. They don't show camels. They don't show caravans of traders fighting the thirst. They show cattle, thousands of them, fat, happy cows grazing in fields of green. They show men and women herding them, living a pastoral life of plenty. They show giraffes stretching their necks to eat from tall trees. They show elephants and rhinos. But the most haunting images are the ones found in the Cave of Swimmers. Paintings of small human figures, horizontal, limbs outstretched, floating, swimming. Think about that. An ancient artist sitting in a cave in the middle of the Sahara, painting people swimming. Today, that cave is surrounded by hundreds of miles of waterless death. But back then, they were likely looking out at a massive lake. Geologists call it Lake Mega Chad. Today, Lake Chad is a small, shrinking puddle, but back then, it was an inland sea. It was bigger than the Caspian Sea. It covered over 100,000 square miles of Central Africa. It was a blue jewel in the center of the green continent. People built their villages on its shores. They fished with harpoons made of bone. They buried their dead with jewelry made of ostrich eggshells. They lived in a world that felt permanent. They watched the sun set over the water every night, believing that the rain would always come. They believed the grass would always grow. But the wobble of the earth is a pendulum, and the pendulum was swinging back. The end of the Green Sahara is one of the most frightening climate events in history because of how fast it happened. For a long time, scientists thought the desertification took thousands of years, a slow drying out. But new evidence from dust cores drilled off the coast of Africa suggests something much more terrifying. It might have happened in a matter of centuries, or perhaps even decades. As the Earth's orbit shifted, the monsoon rains began to weaken. They retreated south, inch by inch. The grass, which held the soil together, began to die. And once the grass dies, the soil is exposed to the wind. The feedback loop began. The bare earth reflected more sunlight, cooling the atmosphere, which pushed the rain even further away. The land dried out. The lakes began to evaporate. Mega Chad, that vast inland sea, shrank. It left behind salt flats and dead fish and abandoned villages. The animals were the first to leave. The elephants, the giraffes. They followed the scent of water south. The hippos, trapped in the shrinking mud pools, died where they lay, their bones eventually bleached white by the returning sun. And the humans, the swimmers, the cattle herders, they had to make a choice: stay and die, or move. They migrated. Some went south, some went north, and many of them moved east toward the only reliable source of water left, the Nile Valley. Historians believe that this drying out, this great catastrophe, forced the scattered tribes of the Green Sahara to come together along the Nile River. It forced them to organize, to irrigate, to build. In a way, the death of the Green Sahara gave birth to ancient Egypt. The pyramids rose only because the grass died. But today, the silence has returned. The wind blows the sand over the rock art, slowly eroding the paintings of the swimmers.
The dunes shift and move like slow waves, burying the ancient riverbeds deeper and deeper. If you listen to the wind in the Sahara tonight, you are listening to a graveyard of a forest that vanished, a memory of a time when the desert was a garden and the sand was sleeping under the grass. The world changes. The green turns to gold, the water turns to dust, and the map is redrawn once more. We leave the hot sands of the Sahara and we travel east, far east, past the coast of Africa, across the vast Indian Ocean, and down into the lonely stretches of the South Pacific. If you look at a map of this corner of the world today, you see Australia, massive, red and solid. And then, 1,000 miles to the southeast, you see New Zealand. Two long, slender islands, isolated in the deep blue sea. They look lonely. They look like accidents of geology, jagged rocks thrown into the ocean at the end of the world. But this is an illusion of the water level. If you were to drain the Pacific Ocean, if you could pull the plug and let the water level drop by 2 kilometers, you wouldn't see two lonely islands. You would see a monster. You would see a massive, sprawling continent, nearly 2/3 the size of Australia. A landmass of sweeping plains, deep valleys and towering mountain ranges. New Zealand is not an island nation. It is merely the highest peaks, the attic of a flooded house. This lost world is called Zealandia, or in the Maori language, Te Reo a Maui. We have to go back in time to see it breathe. Let's go back roughly 85 million years, to the late Cretaceous. The dinosaurs are still alive, but the world is breaking apart. The supercontinent of Gondwana, which held all the southern lands together, is tearing at the seams. For eons, Zealandia was wedged between Australia and Antarctica. It was part of the family. It was covered in lush, dense rainforests, ancient pines, giant ferns, and trees that have no modern names. Dinosaurs walked here, massive long-necked titanosaurs thundered through the valleys, armored ankylosaurs pushed through the undergrowth. It was a loud, vibrant world, a tropical extension of the Antarctic jungle. But the earth began to stretch. The crust beneath Zealandia became restless. It didn't break cleanly, like a cracker. It stretched like taffy. Gravity and the churning mantle began to pull Zealandia away from Australia. The gap opened up, the Tasman Sea was born, and Zealandia drifted out alone into the Pacific. It took its forests with it. It took its dinosaurs. It took its secrets. It became a life raft, a fragment of Gondwana, sailing slowly into the isolation of the ocean.
But as Zealandia drifted, something terrible began to happen. The stretching of the crust had made the land thin. Continents are usually thick, buoyant rafts of granite that float high on the mantle. But Zealandia had been pulled too tight. It was losing its buoyancy. It was getting heavy. And so it began to sink. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe. There was no tsunami. There was no day of destruction. It was a drowning that took millions of years. The ocean nibbled at the edges first. The low-lying coastal plains, where the dinosaurs grazed, turned into swamps. Then the swamps turned into shallow seas. Then the shallow seas turned into the deep. The water moved inland, century by century, millennium by millennium. The forests retreated up the sides of the mountains. The animals were pushed higher and higher. the continent was shrinking. By about 25 million years ago, the drowning was almost complete. 94% of the continent was underwater. The Great Plains, the valleys, the river systems were all gone, buried under a kilometre of blue water. All that remained above the waves were a few scattered islands, the very tips of the highest mountains, small, isolated lifeboats in a vast ocean. The life that survived on these islands became strange. Evolution, working in isolation, created monsters of its own. Without mammals, birds became the rulers. The moa, giant flightless birds, 12 feet tall, stalked the forests like feathery dinosaurs. The Haast's eagle, the largest eagle to ever live, hunted them from the sky. The tuatara, a reptile with a third eye, a living fossil from the age of dinosaurs, sat on the rocks, watching the ocean that had swallowed its home. Zealandia became a land of ghosts, a fragmented kingdom hanging on by its fingertips. The ocean had won, the continent had fallen.
For human history, Zealandia was a secret. When the Polynesian navigators arrived, peering through the mist in their waka canoes, they saw the high mountains of Aotearoa rising from the sea. They saw the clouds snagged on the peaks. They didn't know they were landing on the spine of a giant. When European explorers like Abel Tasman and James Cook arrived, they drew maps of islands. They sailed right over the submerged plains, dropping their anchors onto the sunken fields of a lost world without ever knowing it. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the invention of sonar and satellite gravity mapping, that we began to see the truth. Scientists looked at the bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor, and they saw something that didn't make sense. The water around New Zealand wasn't deep ocean crust, it was continental crust. It was granite, it was land that just happened to be wet. In 2017, geologists finally made it official. They declared Zealandia to be Earth's 8th continent. It was a discovery that rewrote the textbooks. We had missed a continent the size of India simply because it was hiding underwater. Today, if you sail across the Tasman Sea or fly from Sydney to Auckland, look down at the water. It looks empty. It looks dark. But try to imagine what is down there. Beneath the waves, there are fossilized forests. There are riverbeds that haven't seen the sun in 20 million years. There are the bones of dinosaurs that died when this was dry land. It is a silent, pressurized world, a sleeping giant. Zealandia teaches us a lesson about perspective. We define our world by the coastline. We think that land ends where the water begins. But the Earth doesn't care about the water level. The land is still there. It is just holding its breath, waiting, perhaps, for the tectonic cycle to turn again and lift it back up into the sun. But for now, it rests. The Atlantis that is real. The sunken kingdom of the South. Let the waters of the Pacific fade from your mind, and come with me to a place that feels eternal, the Mediterranean Sea. To us, the Mediterranean is the cradle of civilization. It is the blue heart of the ancient world. It is the sea of Odysseus, of Caesar, of merchants and poets. It feels permanent, a vast, calm body of water holding Europe, Africa, and Asia together. But if you were to stand on the rock of Gibraltar, roughly 6 million years ago, you would witness the beginning of a catastrophe. The Mediterranean is not a true ocean. it is a prisoner. It is a basin trapped between continents. Its only lifeline, its only connection to the vast Atlantic Ocean, is that narrow strait at Gibraltar, a tiny gap barely 9 miles wide. And 6 million years ago, due to the slow grind of tectonic plates, Africa pushed north. It slammed into Europe, and the gate was slammed shut. The lifeline was cut. The Mediterranean is a thirsty sea. The sun beats down on it constantly. Evaporation is high. Without the Atlantic water rushing in to replenish it, the level began to drop. It didn't drop by a few inches. It didn't drop by a few feet. It vanished. Over the course of a few thousand years, a geological blink of an eye, the blue turned to grey. The grey turned to white. Imagine standing on the coast of Italy or Greece in that time. You look out expecting to see the waves, but instead you see a drop, a cliff edge leading down into an abyss. The sea was gone. In its place was a valley of salt. Geologists call this the Messinian salinity crisis. It was one of the most extreme environmental changes the Earth has ever seen. The beautiful Mediterranean basin turned into a deep, scorching salt desert. A white hell stretching for 2,000 miles.
Let us descend into the empty basin. If you walked down the continental slope, down to the bottom of the dried-up sea, you would enter a world that feels alien. First, there is the heat. As you descend, the air pressure rises. The bottom of the basin was nearly 2 miles, 3 kilometers below sea level. The air down there would be thick, heavy, and incredibly hot. Temperatures would have soared to over 80 degrees Celsius. It was a furnace, a cauldron of compressed air and blistering salt. The ground beneath your feet would be crunching. The evaporated water left behind everything it had ever held. A layer of salt, gypsum, and mineral deposits nearly 2 kilometers thick. We still see this today. Beneath the modern seafloor, buried under the sand, lie these massive salt giants, the Messinian evaporites, the ghosts of the dried ocean. And the rivers? What happened to the Nile? What happened to the Rhone? They didn't stop flowing, but they had nowhere to go. They had to reach the new, lower bottom of the world. So they cut. They carved. The Nile River, flowing from Africa, turned into a waterfall of unimaginable height. It cut a canyon into the bedrock that was deeper than the Grand Canyon. It slashed its way down to the bottom of the salt desert, a lonely ribbon of fresh water, vanishing into the boiling heat. Geologists found this canyon in the 20th century, buried under Cairo. They couldn't understand how the river had cut so deep until they realized the truth. The river wasn't cutting into the ground, it was falling into an empty sea. Life in the basin was impossible. The salt lakes that remained were toxic, hypersaline pools where only bacteria could survive. The animals of Europe and Africa, seeing this dry bridge, tried to cross. Elephants, hippos, and early ancestors of the horse migrated across the salt flats. But many of them didn't make it. They died in the heat, their bones preserved in the salt, waiting for a flood that wouldn't come for 600,000 years. But nature abhors a vacuum. and the Atlantic Ocean was pushing against the dam at Gibraltar, waiting to get back in. 5.3 million years ago, the dam broke. It might have started as a trickle, a small stream of water flowing over the tectonic ridge. But water is powerful. It erodes. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a river. The river became a catastrophe. This is the Zanclean flood. The ridge at Gibraltar collapsed, and the Atlantic Ocean poured into the empty Mediterranean basin. It wasn't a gentle refilling. It was the largest waterfall in the history of the Earth. Imagine a wall of water flowing at a speed of hundreds of miles per hour. A waterfall dropping a kilometer down into the basin. The noise would have been deafening, a roar that shook the bedrock of Spain and Morocco. The water rose at a terrifying rate. Some models suggest the sea level rose by 10 meters every single day. If you were an animal grazing on the salt flats, you wouldn't have been able to outrun it. The water was simply deleting the landscape. The basin, which had been dry for 500,000 years, filled up in less than 2 years. The heat was quenched, the salt was buried, the canyons of the Nile and the Rhone were flooded, turning into deep underwater estuaries. The Mediterranean Sea was born again. Today, when you look at that calm blue water basking in the sun, it looks peaceful. It looks like it has always been there. But beneath the waves, under the mud, the salt is still there. A thick white scar hiding in the dark. A memory of the time when the sea died and the continents looked down into a burning white abyss. It reminds us that even the oceans are temporary. The map is fluid, and the blue spaces we trust can simply evaporate into thin air. Let the salt of the Mediterranean dry on your skin, and let us put on our furs. We are traveling north again, to the top of the world, to the gap between the east and the west. Today, if you stand on the westernmost tip of Alaska, on the Prince of Wales Cape, and look west, you see the choppy, grey waters of the Bering Strait. Somewhere, roughly 50 miles away through the mist, lies Siberia, Russia, the old world. It seems so close. You can almost touch it, but it is separated by a barrier of freezing water, deadly currents, and floating ice. It is a divide that separates continents, nations, and histories. But 18,000 years ago, in the grip of the last glacial maximum, this water was gone. The world was cold, so cold that the ocean levels had dropped by 120 meters. The water was locked up in the massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe. And in this gap, a new land emerged. Beringia. It was not a narrow bridge. We often call it the Bering Land Bridge, which makes us think of a thin strip of land, like a causeway. But that is wrong. Beringia was a subcontinent. It was a massive, sprawling territory, as wide as Texas or France. It connected Asia to America, turning the two hemispheres into one continuous world. But it wasn't covered in ice. This is the strange paradox of Beringia. While the rest of the north was buried under miles of white glaciers, Beringia was too dry for snow. It was a vast, cold, yellow plain, the Mammoth Steppe. Imagine standing there. The wind is relentless, blowing dust and grit into your face.
The sky is a pale, watery blue. The ground is hard, covered in wild grasses, sagebrush, and tiny hardy flowers that bloom for only a few weeks a year. It looks barren, but it is alive. This was the Serengeti of the Ice Age. Herds of woolly mammoths, thousands strong, moved across the plains like grey ships in a yellow sea. Their long, curved tusks swept the snow away to get to the grass. Woolly rhinos, massive and short-sighted, grunted in the scrub. Herds of ancient horses and bison thundered across the hard earth. And stalking them were the shadows, the scimitar cats, the cave lions, and the short-faced bears. Monsters standing 12 feet tall, sniffing the wind for the scent of blood. It was a harsh world, a world of wind and tooth and claw. But for thousands of years, it was the only road available. It was the highway to the future.
Into this world walked a new kind of animal, humans. They came from the west, from Siberia. They were following the herds. They didn't know they were discovering a new continent. They didn't know they were leaving the old world. To them, it was just the next valley, the next river, the next hunt. Geneticists call this period the Berengenian standstill. For a long time we thought humans just ran across the bridge, racing to get to America. But new evidence suggests they stopped. They lived on Berengea, on that lost, sunken land, for perhaps 5,000 years. Generations were born, lived, and died on a continent that no longer exists. They built fires from mammoth bones because there was no wood. They sewed tents from heavy hides to keep out the biting wind. They sat by their fires in the endless winter nights, telling stories in languages that are now extinct, looking up at the aurora borealis, dancing over a landscape that is now the bottom of the ocean. They were isolated. Behind them, the ice sheets of Siberia blocked the way back. Ahead of them, the massive Laurentide ice sheet blocked the way into America. They were trapped in a pocket of time, a waiting room at the end of the world. During this time, their genetics changed. They became a distinct people, the ancestors of all Native Americans. They were forged in the cold of Berengea. We can imagine their lives, the silence of the steppe, the sound of the wind whistling through the mammoth bones used to weigh down their tents, the constant gnawing fear of the short-faced bear. They were the hardiest people to ever live. They survived the deep freeze by clinging to the edge of the habitable world. And then the world began to change again. The sun grew warmer. The great ice sheets began to melt. The water, which had been locked away for so long, began to return to the sea. The flooding of Berengea was likely slow, but to the people living there it must have felt like a theft. The coastline began to creep inward. The vast yellow plains turned into marshes. The marshes turned into lagoons. The grazing land for the mammoths disappeared. The herds began to thin out. The animals moved higher toward the hills on the eastern and western edges, and the humans followed. Then, roughly 11,000 years ago, the final connection broke. The rising water breached the center of the plain. The Pacific Ocean met the Arctic Ocean. The Bering Strait was born. It severed the world in two. Families were separated. Tribes were cut in half. Those on the east side moved into the Americas, spreading south as the ice melted, becoming the Inuit, the Aztec, the Navajo, the Inca. Those on the west side retreated back into Siberia, becoming the Chukchi and the Yupik. Brothers and sisters separated by a rising wall of water, destined to forget each other for 10,000 years. Today, the remnants of Beringia are still there if you know where to look. In the middle of the Bering Strait, there are two islands, Big Diomede and Little Diomede. They are just 2 miles apart, but they are separated by the international date line. One is in today, one is in tomorrow. These islands are the mountain peaks of the lost continent, the last dry ground of the mammoth steppe. Beneath the water surrounding them lie the camps, the spear points, the bones of the mammoths that didn't make it across. Sometimes, after a storm, the ocean washes artifacts up onto the beaches of Alaska, a piece of ivory carved by a human hand, a tool made of stone that doesn't exist in the area. They are messages from the bottom of the sea, reminders of the lost highway. Beringia was the bridge that populated a hemisphere. It changed the history of the human race, and then, like a drawbridge pulled up after the guests have arrived, it slipped beneath the grey waves, leaving only the wind and the silence of the north. We leave the biting wind of the Arctic steppe behind, and we travel south, down the spine of Asia, past the Himalayas, until we reach the equator. Today, if you look at a map of Southeast Asia, you see a shattered landscape. You see thousands of islands scattered across the tropical sea like broken pieces of green glass. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. They are separated by shallow, warm seas, the Java Sea, the South China Sea. It looks like an archipelago, a water world. But if you were to stand here 20,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age, you would not see water. You would see land. Solid, unbroken, green land. This was Sundaland. It was a massive continent, twice the size of India. It connected Vietnam to Borneo. It welded Java and Sumatra to the mainland of Asia. It was not a collection of islands. It was a single, vast peninsula jutting out from the continent. Imagine standing on what is now the coast of Singapore. Today, you look out at the busy shipping lanes, the tankers moving slowly through the water. But back then, looking south, you would have seen a savanna. You would have seen vast grasslands, punctuated by dark patches of rainforest. You would have seen great herds of elephants, distinct from the ones we know today, migrating across plains that are now 100 meters underwater. You would have heard the roar of tigers echoing in valleys that are now the bottom of the sea. The climate here was cooler than it is today, but it was still tropical. It was a savanna corridor, a lush, vibrant highway that allowed animals to move freely from the mainland to the farthest reaches of the east. But the most spectacular feature of Sundaland was its rivers. Today, the rivers of Borneo and Sumatra flow into the sea and stop. But back then, they kept going. They joined together. Geologists call them the North Sundar River and the East Sundar River. These were colossal waterways. The North Sundar River was likely comparable to the Mekong or the Ganges. It wound its way through the heart of the continent, a massive artery of fresh water, feeding a landscape teeming with life. It flowed north, emptying into the South China Sea. Its delta was massive, a labyrinth of mangroves and swamps. Today, that riverbed is still there. We can see it with sonar. A ghost river, carved into the mud of the ocean floor, silent and filled with salt water. Humans lived here in great numbers. While Europe was buried under ice and North America was a windy steppe, Sundaland was a refuge. It was a paradise of warmth and food. Genetic studies suggest that this region might have been one of the most densely populated places on Earth during the Ice Age. People lived along the banks of those great lost rivers. They hunted in the forests. They fished in the endless deltas. They likely built boats, navigating the waterways of this green continent. They were the ancestors of the Austronesian people, the greatest navigators the world would ever see. But then the ice began to melt. And the tragedy of Sunderland is that it was destroyed by the very thing that made it beautiful: water. As the glaciers in the north retreated, the sea levels rose. This is known as the post-glacial sea level rise. But it didn't happen smoothly. It happened in pulses. Meltwater Pulse 1A, a scientific name for a terrifying event. Roughly 14,000 years ago, the sea level rose by 20 meters in just a few centuries. For the people of Sunderland, the world was shrinking. The coastline was not stable. It was marching inland. Every year, the high tide mark was higher. Every decade, a village had to be abandoned. The vast savannas, the hunting grounds of the elephants, turned into marshes. The marshes turned into mudflats. The mudflats turned into the sea. The great river systems were flooded. The salt water pushed upstream, killing the trees, poisoning the freshwater fish. The savanna corridor was broken. The land was being strangled. We can imagine the confusion. The elders telling stories of a time when the land went on forever. The children asking why the ocean was so hungry. As the water rose, the high ground became isolated. The mountains of Borneo, the volcanoes of Java, the ridges of Sumatra, they were cut off from each other. They became islands, lifeboats in a rising tide. The animals were trapped. The tigers on Bali, the elephants on Borneo, they could no longer migrate. They were marooned on these new islands, destined to evolve in isolation or to slowly fade away. By about 6,000 years ago, Sunderland was gone. The sea had stabilized at its current level. The continent had drowned. In its place was the geography we know today, a fragmented world of islands and straits. But the memory of the flood lingered. Some historians and folklorists believe that the drowning of Sunderland is the origin of the great flood myths that permeate Southeast Asian cultures. Stories of waters rising to cover the mountains, of ancestors fleeing in boats, of a golden age lost beneath the waves. Some have even suggested, controversially, that Sunderland was the inspiration for the legend of Atlantis, a great, civilized land swallowed by the sea. While Plato placed Atlantis in the west, the reality of a sunken continent matches the story of the East far better. Today, the shallow seas of Indonesia are among the most biodiverse in the world. The Java Sea is teeming with fish and coral. But it is a shallow life. The water is rarely more than 50 or 100 meters deep. It is a flooded shelf. If you dive down to the bottom, you are not diving into an ancient abyss. You are diving onto a prairie. Beneath the coral reefs, there are layers of peat, compressed, rotted vegetation, the remains of the rainforests that stood there. Sometimes, oil drillers off the coast of Malaysia will pull up cores of earth containing mangrove roots and pollen from upland flowers from deep beneath the seabed. It is a haunting reminder. The fish are swimming through the canopy of a ghost forest. The sharks are hunting over the trails where humans once walked. Sunderland teaches us that geography is fragile. We build our nations on the land, assuming it will stay. But the Earth is a water planet, and when the water wants the land back, it takes it.
the green continent, is still there. It is just sleeping under a blanket of blue, waiting for the next ice age to wake it up.
We travel now to the very bottom of the map, to the white spot, to Antarctica. When you look at a globe today, Antarctica is a void. It is a place of absence. It is defined by what is not there. No cities, no trees, no flowing rivers. It is a continent of ice, 1.5 miles thick, crushing the bedrock into the mantle. It is the coldest, windiest, driest place on Earth. But if we were to strip away the ice, like peeling the skin off an orange, we would find something shocking. We would find that Antarctica is not a flat, frozen wasteland. It is a landscape of diverse and dramatic geography. There are mountain ranges buried under the ice, ranges the size of the Alps that no human eye has ever seen. The Gamburtsev Mountains, the Ghost Mountains, stand 3,000 meters tall, completely entombed in the white dark. And if we travel back in time, roughly 50 million years into the Eocene epoch, we would see these mountains differently. We wouldn't see snow. We would see green. Imagine standing on the coast of Antarctica back then. The air is not biting. It is mild, perhaps 15 degrees Celsius, like a spring day in London or Seattle. You are not wearing a parka. You are standing in the shade of a massive tree. This was the Antarctic rainforest. It covered the continent. It wasn't a sparse tundra. It was a dense, chaotic, temperate jungle. We know this because we have found the evidence. On Seymour Island and in drill cores pulled up from the seafloor, scientists have found pollen. They have found spores. They have found the fossilized leaves of ferns and beech trees and the ancestors of the baobab. They have even found the fossilized sperm of worms encased in a cocoon of a leech, preserved on a leaf that fell 50 million years ago. It paints a picture of a world that is almost impossible to reconcile with the Antarctic we know. A world of muddy rivers, humming insects, and thick, soft moss covering the ground. But there was one thing about this forest that made it unique. One thing that made it unlike any other jungle on Earth today. The darkness.
Antarctica sits at the pole, and no matter how warm the climate gets, geometry does not change. The tilt of the Earth is the same. This means that for 6 months of the year, the sun does not set. It circles the horizon, a perpetual golden afternoon. The trees would have grown furiously during this time. The photosynthesis would have been constant. The forest would have been a frantic explosion of life, drinking in the endless light. But then the season would turn. The sun would dip below the horizon, and it wouldn't come back. For 6 months, the Antarctic forest was plunged into the polar night. Imagine a rainforest in pitch darkness, not for a night, but for a season. It wasn't cold enough to freeze, or at least not deeply. The ocean currents kept the continent warm. So you had this surreal, impossible environment, a warm, humid, breathing forest existing in total, absolute shadow. How did the trees survive? We think they went dormant. They shut down their systems. They dropped their leaves, or perhaps they evolved to keep them, turning dark and sluggish. But the animals? They had to keep moving. We have found the bones of these shadow walkers. There were marsupials, small opossum-like creatures scuttling through the dark leaf litter. There were huge birds, terror birds, hunting by sound. And there were mammals, the Notiolophus, a strange sheep-like creature that grazed in the dark. Imagine standing in that forest. The air is thick with the smell of rotting leaves and damp earth. It is pitch black, except perhaps for the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi on the rotting logs. Above you, through the canopy of the invisible trees, you might see the aurora australis, the southern lights dancing in the sky. Curtains of green and purple light casting weird, shifting shadows on the forest floor. It was a Gothic wonderland, a place of silence and secrets, a world where life had adapted to the rhythm of the stars, sleeping for half of the year and partying for the other half. It feels like a fantasy setting, but it was real. It was here, on this planet, a continent of green, thriving at the end of the world.
So, where did it go? It didn't wash away like Doggerland. It didn't dry up like the Sahara. It was buried. As we discussed in the previous journey, the isolation of Antarctica cooled the world. The ice sheets began to form on the tops of the Gamburtsev Mountains. At first, they were just glaciers, rivers of ice flowing down the valleys. The forest would have retreated. The trees would have moved down the slopes away from the cold. But the ice kept coming. It was a slow, crushing death. The glaciers expanded. They merged. They formed a dome. We can imagine the last stand of the Antarctic trees, perhaps on the coastline, clinging to the edge of the water. The last Nothofagus tree shivering in a wind that was suddenly too cold to bear. The last leaf falling, not because of the dark, but because of the frost. And then the white silence took over. The ice thickened. It covered the mountains. It covered the valleys. It covered the forests. It didn't destroy them completely. It entombed them. Deep beneath the ice sheet today, there are likely fossils that have been frozen for 30 million years, perfectly preserved snapshots of that lost world. There are lakes down there. Lake Vostok, buried under 4 kilometers of ice. It has been sealed off from the rest of the world for millions of years. It is a time capsule. Scientists believe that if we could drill down without contaminating it, we might find the DNA of the things that lived in the dark forest. We might find the pollen of the ghost trees. Antarctica is a map that has been painted over with whiteout. We look at it and see nothing. But underneath, the landscape is still there. The mountains are still standing. The valleys are still deep. They are just waiting, sleeping in the cold, remembering the time when they were green and the southern lights shone down on a world full of life.
We return now to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. But we are not looking at the sea this time. We are looking at the land. Imagine standing on a white limestone cliff in Croatia, or perhaps walking through the marble quarries of Carrara in Italy. The stone is bright, it is hard, it feels like the foundation of Europe. But if you were to ask a geologist where this stone came from, they would tell you a strange story. They would tell you that the ground beneath your feet does not belong to Europe. It belongs to a lost world, a continent that was swallowed whole. This is the story of Greater Adria. It is the size of Greenland, a massive slab of continental crust, and for millions of years it has been hiding in plain sight. To find it, we have to go back 240 million years to the Triassic period. The world is dominated by Pangaea, but Pangaea is breaking up. A large piece of continental crust breaks away from what is now North Africa. It is a splinter of Gondwana. It begins to drift north, moving slowly across the ancient Tethys Ocean. This was Greater Adria. It wasn't a solid, blocky continent like Africa or Australia. It was something more beautiful. It was a partially submerged continent, a massive, tropical archipelago. Imagine the Caribbean or the Maldives, but scaled up to the size of a continent. It was a world of shallow, turquoise seas, vast platforms of white limestone, endless coral reefs teeming with ammonites and marine reptiles, chains of low-lying islands covered in ferns and cycads. It was a paradise of calcium and light. The sun beat down on the shallow water, encouraging the growth of the reefs layer upon layer for millions of years. These reefs became the rock. The living creatures lived, died, and became the limestone foundation of the continent. Greater Adria moved north. It was a slow, silent cruise, a raft of tropical islands sailing towards a collision course with destiny. Because waiting in the north, like a massive, immovable wall, was Europe. About 100 million years ago, Greater Adria hit Europe. But it wasn't a simple crash. It was a slow-motion destruction, a tectonic murder. Europe is a big plate. Adria was smaller, and the laws of geology are cruel to the small. As the two continents collided, the heavy, oceanic part of the Adria plate began to dive. It slid underneath the southern edge of Europe. This is called subduction. Imagine a conveyor belt. Adria was being pulled down into the hot, crushing depths of the Earth's mantle. It was sinking into the magma. But the collision wasn't clean. The top layer of Greater Adria, those beautiful limestone platforms, the coral reefs, the sediments that had built up for eons, they were too light to sink. They were buoyant. So as the continent slid under Europe, the top layer was scraped off. Think of it like a knife scraping the icing off a cake, or a bulldozer pushing a pile of earth. Europe acted like a scraper. It peeled the skin off Greater Adria. The limestone was sheared off the sinking plate. It buckled, it folded, it crumpled up. The violence of this is hard to comprehend. Miles of solid rock bending like paper. The wreckage of the lost continent piled up higher and higher and higher. And what did this wreckage become? It became the mountains. The Alps, the Apennines running down the spine of Italy, the Dinarides in the Balkans, the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, the Pindus Mountains in Greece. These are not European mountains. Not really. They are the crushed, folded and uplifted remains of Greater Adria. When you go skiing in the Dolomites or hiking in the Julian Alps, you are walking on the ruins of a tropical reef. You are standing on the corpses of the coral that once grew in the warm waters of the Tethys Ocean. The mountain peaks are the icing that was scraped off. The rest of the continent, the cake, continued to dive. It went deep into the mantle, deeper than we can drill, where it slowly melted and returned to the fire of the earth. So, is Greater Adria gone? Not entirely. There are pieces of it that refused to sink, pieces that stayed on the surface, defiant and solid. If you travel to the heel of the boot of Italy, the region of Puglia, you are standing on a piece of Greater Adria that survived intact. It is a fragment of the old continent that didn't get scraped. If you walk through the canals of Venice, you are floating over the old continental shelf. Venice sits on the very edge of the Adria Plate, a survivor of the Great Collision. Istria in Croatia, parts of the Southern Alps, these are the breadcrumbs of a lost world. But the most haunting part of this story is that we only found it recently. For centuries, geologists were confused by the rocks in the Mediterranean. They found limestone in Italy that matched limestone in Greece and Turkey. They saw magnetic signatures in the rocks that didn't align with Europe or Africa. It was a puzzle with missing pieces. It wasn't until they used seismic tomography, using earthquake waves to X-ray the Earth, that they saw the truth. They looked deep underground, hundreds of kilometers down, and there, floating in the mantle like a ghost, was a cold, dense slab of rock, the sunken body of Greater Adria. We had been walking on its skin, the mountains, without realizing that its heart was beating miles beneath our feet. It changes how you look at the world. We think of continents as permanent homes, but Greater Adria teaches us that continents can be consumed. They can be eaten by their neighbors. Europe is a graveyard. It is built on the bones of the land it swallowed. The white cliffs, the marble statues, the high peaks, they are all monuments to a tropical paradise that drifted too close and was peeled apart, layer by layer. The ground is not just dirt, it is wreckage, and we are the tourists walking through the ruins.
Let the mountains of Europe fade into the mist, and let us feel the sun on our skin again. We are traveling to the middle of the Indian Ocean, to a place that looks like paradise. Mauritius. If you look at a travel brochure, you see white sand beaches, you see palm trees swaying in the trade winds, you see luxury resorts and turquoise water. It is a volcanic island born from fire, relatively recently in geological time. It is young, roughly 9 million years old, a mere infant in the life of the planet. But if you were to walk along those pristine beaches and pick up a handful of sand, you might be holding a lie. In 2013, scientists were analyzing the sand from the beaches of Mauritius. They were looking at crystals called zircons. Zircons are incredibly tough. They are time capsules. They survive erosion, magma, and pressure. They can tell you exactly how old the rock they came from is. The scientists expected the zircons to match the age of the island, 9 million years, maybe 10. But when they dated the crystals, the machines gave them a number that was impossible. 3 billion years. These tiny grains of sand sitting on a young volcanic island were older than the dinosaurs, older than complex life. They were as old as the continents themselves. It was a mystery. How could a 3 billion-year-old piece of the Earth's crust be sitting on a 9 million-year-old island? It was like finding a Roman coin inside a freshly baked loaf of bread. It shouldn't be there. The answer was beneath their feet. Mauritius is not just a volcano rising from the sea floor. It is a tombstone. It is built on top of a corpse. Buried deep beneath the lava and the coral and the blue water lies a lost continent, a microcontinent. They named it Mauritia. To see Mauritia alive, we have to go back 84 million years, to the breakup of Gondwana. The Indian Ocean is a crime scene of continental drift. Back then, India and Madagascar were connected. They were joined at the hip, and wedged between them, acting as a bridge, was a strip of land, a ribbon of continental crust, roughly a quarter of the size of Madagascar. This was Mauritius. It was a dry, rugged land. It connected the great land masses, allowing dinosaurs and early mammals to cross between India and Madagascar. It was a solid, ancient piece of the Archean crust. But India was restless. It was one of the fastest-moving continents in history. It began to pull away, racing north towards its eventual collision with Asia. As India pulled away, it tore Mauritius apart. It wasn't a clean break, it was a stretching. Imagine pulling a piece of dough until it gets thin and then breaks in the middle. Mauritius was stretched so thin that it lost its structural integrity. It fragmented, it broke into ribbons of rock, and as the crust thinned, it sank. The ocean rushed in. The bridge was broken. The dinosaurs on India were now passengers on a raft heading north. The animals on Madagascar were left behind in isolation. And Mauritius, the land that had connected them, slipped beneath the waves. But the ocean wasn't finished with it. As the fragments of the lost continent sank, they passed over a hotspot, a plume of magma rising from the deep mantle. This is the reunion hotspot. It acted like a welding torch. It blasted magma up through the broken pieces of the sunken continent. The volcanoes erupted underwater. They built mountains of black lava on top of the ancient drowned rock. These volcanoes grew until they broke the surface, forming the islands we know today. Mauritius, reunion. So the island of Mauritius is actually a mask. It is a layer of young lava hiding the old face of the continent below. When the volcanoes erupted, they brought up the zircons. They dragged those tiny crystals from the ancient basement up through the throat of the volcano and spat them out onto the beach. The sand is a message from the deep, saying, "I am still here."
There is a poetic tragedy to Mauritius, because it is connected to another famous extinction. Mauritius was the home of the dodo. The dodo was a flightless bird. It had no predators. It lived in a paradise of fruit and safety. It had evolved in perfect isolation. When humans arrived in the 17th century, the dodo didn't know to be afraid. It was wiped out in a matter of decades. It became the global symbol of extinction, dead as a dodo. But think about where the dodo lived. It walked on the soil of a volcano that was built on the grave of a continent. The dodo was a ghost living on top of a ghost. The bird is gone. We have only sketches and a few bones left. And the land it walked on, the true land, is buried under kilometers of rock and water. Scientists have now mapped the gravity signature of the area, and they can see it. They can see the thick, dense crust of Mauritius stretching out under the Indian Ocean, a lost archipelago of granite hidden in the dark. It reminds us that the Earth is a layered place. History is stacked on top of history. When you swim in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, you are floating over a lost world, a world that was torn apart by the speed of India, a world that was drowned and then buried in fire. The sand on the beach remembers. The crystals in your hand have seen the world when the atmosphere was toxic. They have seen the continents united. They have seen the breakup. They are waiting, glittering in the sun, for someone to notice that they are older than the island they rest upon. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. We have travelled through the deep past. We have walked on sunken bridges and swum in dried-up seas. We have seen how the map of the world has been drawn and erased over and over again. But before we close the book, we must look in one final direction: forward. If you look at a map on your wall today, it feels finished. The Atlantic Ocean is a wide, safe barrier. The Americas are separate from Europe and Africa. Australia sits alone in the south. It feels like the final draft of the Earth. But geology does not stop. The ground beneath your chair is moving right now. It is moving at the speed that fingernails grow, 2 centimeters a year. It seems like nothing, but give it time, deep time, and it changes everything. The Atlantic Ocean, which seems so vast, is actually aging. It is widening right now, pushing the Americas away. But eventually, the cycle will turn. The subduction zones will wake up, the ocean floor will begin to sink, and the Atlantic will start to close. It will take 250 million years, a length of time that the human mind cannot truly grasp, but it will happen. The Americas will reverse course. They will drift east. Africa will continue its march north. Antarctica and Australia will move up from the bottom of the world. They are all heading for a reunion, a collision. They are moving to form the next supercontinent, Pangaea Proxima. The next Pangaea. Imagine standing on the Earth 250 million years from now. The familiar shapes are gone. There is no United States, no China, no Brazil. There is only the land. A single massive landmass surrounded by a single massive ocean. The coastline of the Eastern Americas has crashed into the coastline of Africa and Europe. New York, London, and Dakar are no longer separated by water. They are smashed together, buried deep inside a new mountain range that rivals the Himalayas. The Atlantic Ocean is gone. It has been squeezed out of existence, leaving only a few salt lakes trapped in the high valleys of the new mountains. What is life like on this future world? It is a world of extremes. Because the supercontinent is so huge, the ocean winds cannot reach the center. The interior of Pangaea Proxima is a desert, a hyper-arid red wasteland larger than the Sahara and the Gobi combined. Temperatures in the center of the continent fluctuate wildly, scorching hot days, freezing cold nights. It is a harsh, unforgiving environment. The lush forests, the green places we know today, are pushed to the edges. They cling to the coastlines, where the moisture from the superocean can reach them. The mammals we know might be gone. Evolution will have moved on. Perhaps new creatures, descendants of the squid or the rats, or animals we cannot even imagine, are walking across these new deserts. The Mediterranean Sea, which we saw dry up once before, is gone forever. Africa has crushed it against Europe. The Alps and the Pyrenees have been pushed up even higher, merging into a single, jagged scar running across the northern hemisphere. It is a lonely world. The night sky has changed. The stars have moved. The constellations we use to navigate, Orion, the Big Dipper, have drifted apart. And the moon is farther away. It looks smaller in the sky. Its pull on the tides is weaker. The ocean is calmer. The days are longer because the Earth's rotation has slowed down. It is a quiet, tired Earth. But it is still beautiful in a stark, geological way. It is a testament to the power of the engine that drives our planet. The heat in the core pushing the plates around the surface like foam on a cup of coffee.
But even Pangaea Proxima is not the end. If we look even further beyond the next supercontinent, we see the final fate of the map. The sun is getting brighter. Slowly, steadily, it is burning through its fuel. In about 600 million years, the sun will be luminous enough to disrupt the chemistry of the Earth. The weathering of the rocks will speed up. This will suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and eventually the levels will drop too low for plants to survive. Photosynthesis, the engine of life, will stop. The forests will die. The oxygen levels will crash. The animals, gasping in the thinning air, will fade away. And then, 1 billion years from now, the oceans will begin to boil. The water that covered Doggerland, the water that flooded the Black Sea, the water that we are made of, will turn to steam. It will be lost to space. The Earth will become a desert planet, a rust-red marble, silent and dry, orbiting a brilliant star. The map will finally be erased, not by water, but by light. It is a heavy thought, but it is not a sad one. It is simply the nature of things. Everything has a season. The continents, the oceans, the species, and the planet itself. We are lucky to be here now. We are living in the Goldilocks time. The continents are spread out. The climate is mild. The oceans are blue. We have forests and ice caps and coral reefs. We are living in the brief, beautiful moment between the fire and the ice, between the drowned worlds of the past and the dry world of the future. We are the travelers on the ship, watching the scenery pass by. And what beautiful scenery it is. So, as you close your eyes tonight, visualize the map of the world, trace the lines of the coast in your mind. But remember, those lines are just drawn in sand. The Earth is fluid. It is moving. It is breathing. The lost worlds are beneath us, the future worlds are ahead of us, and we are here, safe in the present, drifting through the dark on the most beautiful ship in the universe. And that concludes our journey through the lost maps of history. We have stood on the grassy plains of the North Sea and walked through the dark forests of Antarctica. We have seen continents drown and oceans evaporate. These stories remind us that the world is not a static stage. It is a living thing. It changes, it evolves, and it forgets. The land beneath your home has likely been a seafloor, a desert, and a mountain peak, all in the span of deep time. We are just the current tenants. If you enjoyed this voyage into the deep past, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep the lantern lit and the library open. But for now, the atlas is closed. The maps are rolled up. The dust has settled. The night is yours. Sleep well